Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our seminar on the question of queer neutrality, apartness, erasure, and intimacy. Let me begin by thanking the Jackman Humanities Institute and the Center for Comparative Literature at the University of Toronto for generously sponsoring our gathering today. I'm just delighted to be here and to be acting as moderator of our roundtable discussion of John's compelling, courageous, beautiful, and strange book. Thank you very much, John, for writing it and for making worklessness the subject of such felicitous work. This evening, I'd like to keep things as informal as possible, and my happy task will be to introduce our speakers and then to ask them to share some brief remarks about the decision between us, after which I will help facilitate a discussion among our panelists. At a certain point, I'll open the discussion to the room as a whole and encourage those of you who so graciously have attended this evening to share questions and to join us in the conversation. And towards the conclusion of this evening's colloquium, I'm going to ask John to say a few things about what life has been like after the decision between us. Before introducing each of our speakers, let me say a few quick things, and I hope at some point to consider very briefly Stephen Andrews' remarkable memorial installation facsimile, an example of what John might call a retreating portrait. But for now, let me just mention this. I've just spoken here of our presence this evening as a gathering, a roundtable, and a colloquium, notwithstanding the fact that in the effervescent wake of John's book, it becomes important more than ever perhaps now, precisely to put terms like these, namely gathering, roundtable, and colloquium, even conversation, as well as any number of their liberal analogues, under erasure. Which is to say, to use them, yes, but also to tarry always in ways whose consequences cannot be known in advance, with forms of non-relation that make trouble for ideas and practices of consensus, conciliation, mutuality, recognition, and indeed the social itself. Here tonight we not only discuss the shared space of separation, but are, after all, fully imbricated in it, unmade by the neutral in the conversation that we make. John's book gives us a robust language with which to think of the force of this unbecoming, not only in the archives that he treats with such enormous and exemplary care, but also more broadly in the worlds of which those archives form a consequential part, worlds that include our convocation this evening. Those worlds also include our classrooms, something that is in front of mind for me amid the semiotic inferno of the end of term. I'm thinking this evening of the work of the inimitable Deborah Britzman, the great educator and theorist of education, whose work makes legible the roiling impersonality of forces that at once unwork the work of education and make it possible. John's book is decidedly not psychoanalytic, like Deborah Britzman's work, which is decidedly psychoanalytic. Yet it electrifies new possibilities for, I would argue, a psychoanalytic understanding of that mysterious thing, the educational relation. Deborah always says to me, David, you are not responsible for your students' unconsciousnesses. Advice I, in fact, am constitutively not able to take up, but that I would like to take up, maybe one day, when I finally learn how to live, how to teach, when I embrace a certain irresponsibility in the classroom and let loose, like some wild animal, a certain asociality in that place that is otherwise so ferociously committed on our behalf to sociality and socialization, and instead to affirm what always already makes the classroom so fiercely difficult, so irresistible, so taxing, namely that it too is a shared space of separation. Imagine the course evaluations. Using a score from 1 to 10, please rate your experience of the shared space of separation. If students have nothing to say, Deborah says, this is her counseling. I feel like every time I have lunch with her, it's like a psychoanalytic session about my life as a teacher. If students have nothing to say in your classes, David, she says, then sit there and say nothing. Another piece of really good advice
I find impossible to accept. But the idea of it fascinates, by which I mean the recognition that silence, far from being an absence that must be nervously filled, is the trace of an abstention or erasure without which we could neither speak nor listen, neither teach nor learn. How to honor that silence and neutrally to mourn after John's Barthes, the losses of the unbecoming classroom. I think here of what Thomas Dutoit says after Derrida, without an unteachable, we cannot teach and are not teachers. It's not PowerPoint strategies or clickers or flipped classrooms that we need, but a pedagogy of tarrying not with each other, but with a recursive chain of adjoining that isn't easily described phenomenologically or psychically, and which I might describe using a language that admittedly isn't John's, but that I do think remains valuable, as inhumanly figural, by which I mean, after Deman, the adjacencies, the anonymous and machine-like decidings that bring us together in the mode of holding apart, out of which we invent and reinvent the worlds that we call human. So let me begin then by introducing our speakers, and then, as I say, I'll ask them to say a few remarks to get the discussion going. First of all, we have tonight, I'm delighted to say, Stacey D'Erasmo, who is the author of the novels Tea, A Seahorse Year, The Sky Below, and Wonderland, and the nonfiction book The Art of Intimacy, The Space Between, about which we were talking just before. She's a former Stegner Fellow, the recipient of a 2009 Guggenheim in Fellowship in Fiction, and the winner of an outstanding mid-career novelist prize from the Lambda Literary Foundation. I wonder, mid-career, I'm guessing, must make you feel old. I hope not, but it's such a curious phrase.
It's good to make it to mid.
You made it.
It's good to make it.
You made it. Stacey's essays, features, and reviews have appeared in a number of venues, including the New York Times Magazine, the New York Times Book Review, the New Yorker, the Boston Review, the New England Review, and Plowshares, amongst other publications. And Stacey is currently visiting associate professor of writing at Barnard College. I'm also delighted to welcome my dear friend and academic boyfriend, Jacques Khalip, who's associate professor in the Department of English at Brown. He's the author of just a wonderful book entitled Anonymous Life, Romanticism and Dispossession, and is co-editor of Releasing the Image from Literature to the New Media, both published by Stanford, and is editor of a forthcoming collection of essays entitled Constellations of a Contemporary Romanticism. Jacques is currently completing a book-length manuscript titled Now No More, Last Romanticism, Kant to Hujar, a study of romantic and post-romantic reflections on extinction and wasted life through literature, photography, and film. Our next speaker is Etienne Turpin, and he is a philosopher studying, designing, and curating and writing about complex urban systems, political economies of data and infrastructure, aesthetics and visual culture, and Southeast Asia colonial scientific history. He's the principal director of Anexact Office, a design research practice committed to interventive, multidisciplinary urbanism, artistic and curatorial experimentation, and applied philosophical inquiry, based in Jakarta, Indonesia. Etienne is the editor of Architecture in the Anthropocene, Encounters Among Design, Deep Time, Science and Philosophy, a book well worth looking at, let me say, and co-editor of Art in the Anthropocene, Encounters Among Aesthetics, Politics, Environments, and Epistemologies. His first monograph, Terrible is the Earth, is forthcoming this year. Our last speaker, who's absent but will be present in the form of a video presentation, is Tom McDonough, who was unable to come this evening. He is a writer and critic based in upstate New York and Toronto, whose work addresses the intersections of art, political struggle in the post-war era, with a special emphasis on France. He is widely known for his books on the Situationist International, which include The Beautiful Language of My Century, Reinventing the Language of Contestation in Post-War France, Guy Debord and the Situationist International, Text and Documents, and The Situationists and the City. McDonough's essays on contemporary art and photography have appeared in journals like After All, Art Forum, and Osmos, where he is a contributing editor. So, without further ado, let me turn to you, Stacey.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I wrote, can you guys hear me? Is this good? Yes? Okay. I wrote out my remarks. So thank you to John and to the Jackman Humanities Institute for inviting me to this discussion. It's really a great pleasure to be here. And also I'm getting wildly crushed out on Toronto, so so it's great to be here. So I have to admit that I was a little bit surprised to get the invitation from John. I'm primarily a novelist, and I speak theory about as well as I speak French, which is to say enough to get around, order breakfast, ask for directions, take a left at Rancière, but I'm not fluent. And the reason that John asked me is that I wrote a book-length essay called The Art of Intimacy, The Space Between, in which I looked at how it is that writers create a sense of intimacy on the page, intimacy among characters, between reader and writer, erotic and thanatopic intimacies, intimacies for which we don't have a name. I wrote this book for a literary series on craft and criticism, but I'm sure that my book was very frustrating for any apprentice writer, because when I looked at various texts, what I found was that these intimacies were not, strictly speaking, there. Instead, they were produced by what John, in his book, calls the perispace or the periperformative, the space around, the space between. It was shocking, actually, reading John's book. We don't know each other, and yet I felt as if we had some cosmic mind meld up,
Which, of course, is how I felt when I was reading your book.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Anyway, so our sense as readers that an intimacy has occurred is made up by various meetings, often quite brief or glancing, in verb tenses, in the image, in murderous transaction, in white space, and so on. And I opened the book with an epigraph from Gertrude Stein from the roast beef section of Tender Buttons, among my favorite sections of that, where she says, "The kindly way to feel separating is to have a space between. This shows a likeness," which really we could just stop actually there. that kind of is it. My job as a novelist is easier than any of yours, because all I have to do is give the reader the feeling that something has happened, say an intimacy of some kind. If that intimacy was detonated in the margins of the page, in the syntax of the scene, in the shadows of the subjunctive, the reader, like Nancy's image of Psyche, doesn't know and doesn't care. The reader, unlike the Psyche, who is, of course, more awake in the myth than prone and unconscious or maybe dead, as she is in Nancy's little thing about her, the reader doesn't lift the lamp. And if you say to the reader, as I did, well, the room is empty, the hat is empty, there is no rabbit, also no room and no hat, the reader basically shrugs. She already knew that. But it would be highly disingenuous of me to say that I don't see the stakes of John's argument, that I don't have stakes in it, that I'm a stranger here, I don't speak the language, I am not subject to your borders, I'm just passing and passing through. Je ne parle pas Nancy. Because as John points out in his discussion of Felix Gonzalez Torres's Untitled, that image of the unmade bed on the billboard, which you can see the top of it there, is not, quote, the representational visual form added to a pre-existing content, e.g. privacy, domesticity, coupledom, but is the very scene of the ethical political contest over these various terms and the performative spatial praxes to which they are conventionally assigned, close quote. It seemed to me that in reading John's book that the image of an unmade bed, the proposition that there could be an unmade bed, that the bed could be unmade, kept appearing and reappearing. in Rauschenberg's Erasure of the de Kooning drawing, in the mystic writing pad discussed by Freud, in the beds used by Duras, by Breat, by Nancy, in Barthes's embrace of haiku and photography, and his impossible wish to be exempted from the image, what he calls it in The Neutral, as a kind of social military service, in the Zen concept of satori. Barthes's Neutral, of course, is an unmade bed. Excuse me. Felix Gonzalez Torres's Pile of Candy is an unmade bed, and the photographs in the book by Faucon and Baudonnet are unmade beds. John's proposition is a scandal. And as an American, it's fitting to me that we're having this discussion in Canada, where the draft dodgers once went. John is clearly a gentleman and a scholar, but his proposition is obscene, and it's getting more obscene by the minute in the world in which we live. I accept, not without a certain amount of trepidation. I kept thinking about that queer slogan from the 80s, "An army of lovers cannot fail," and how different it would sound to us today to say an army of exiles cannot fail. But then, of course, erase the army, erase the forward-moving syntax, erase the verb, erase the sense of failure of success, lift the sheet on the mystic writing pad. All you're left with then are the exiles, and maybe even just the ex. All lovers are ex-lovers. The term queer neutrality socially is now an oxymoron, if not an outrage. We are more wedded to identity than we have ever been. Many of the people in their makeshift boats on the crossing die because the space between is a perilous passage in which one cannot live. The prepositions to or from are mandated and in very concrete terms. Indeed, the prepositions to and from have tremendous power at the moment. They are the prepositions du jour, if not du siècle. One can live and die of them. Other prepositions, beyond, around, between, beside, before, after, behind, are powerless. They are the prepositions of the unmade bed. They're scandalous prepositions and propositions. And I mean this very, I'm saying it in kind of a funny way, but I mean this very earnestly and with a certain amount of concern, which I think we probably share. To dwell in powerlessness, in betweenness, is a scandal as well, if not also high-risk behavior. To suggest that the phrase, "this place," as in John's discussion of Gonzalez Torres's 2 stacks of paper labeled "somewhere better than this place" and "nowhere better than this place," refers not to one or the other places, but to the place that is shared by both of them, flies in the face not only of geopolitics, but also of basic Western identity. Further, to posit that we already have the freedom to decide to partake in, to sustain, as John says, the inappropriate space between us as no thing and already unmade, to take the candy and eat it, is increasingly unsayable. John seems to be suggesting that we take candy from strangers, indeed that taking candy from strangers is a freedom that we already possess. His book itself, as much as the artworks that are discussed there, offers us that invitation, that decision. It is an invitation to powerlessness, to traitorous collaboration, to unbecoming. A novel that is an unmade bed in these terms is a novel that will not make up its mind, and as a result will not make up the reader's mind. In fact, it will unmake the reader's mind. One can say that all writing and all novels are already unmade beds, but I think that that's too facile. I can think of works that seem to me to be unmade beds. Gide's The Immoralist, Duras' The Lover, Teresa Hak Kyung Cha's Dictée, Renata Adler's Speedboat, all of Jane Bowles, all of Genet, of course. I was also thinking about, actually, the Marina Abramovich recent performance piece, The Artist is Present, right, as a kind of, as really enacting that decision between us and the unmade bed. But these novels are works of unbecoming. They unbecome the reader, and the pun seems apt as well. They're unbecoming books. They don't make anyone look good, or bad for that matter. They deliver us into a freedom from interpretation and identity that is uncomfortable. We become quite naked as readers. As John says, what turns us on turns us out. And I think the puns are apt there as well. Being turned out as being exiled, and being turned out as being prostituted, offered up to strangers, possibly strangers with candy. We are given or shown our freedom, our responsibility, our nakedness, and frankly, this isn't why most people read novels or write them. The marriage plot is more popular now than ever. The ability to discern this freedom, to dwell in it or at it, to see it as a decision that is always on offer, to apprehend works of art from this free position, is severely constricted at the present moment. One of the things that I found really moving about John's book is that he wasn't calling for this. He was saying his exploration rests on a freedom that is already there. And I found that quite fascinating, actually, that what he was calling for, in a certain sense, was a shift in perception to see the ground on which we are already standing, right? But these days, if you're without a place, you are an exile or a terrorist or a traitor. If you wish to be without a place or attempt to be without a place, you have lost your mind. This is the moment in which we find ourselves. John's book strikes me as a kind of diagnosis, or perhaps a punctum, to use Barth's term. What has occurred to me in the wake of reading this book is a state that I might call noticing. It seems to me, to return to Stein, a kindly way to feel separating, to have a space between, to show a likeness. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Stacey.
Jacques?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you to all of you, and to John for arranging this. I've been reading John's work for quite a while, and so it's a huge sort of like pleasure to sort of take that kind of personal and virtual sort of engagement and sort of see it in this kind of space. I sort of feel what I'm going to say informally really is kind of like a footnote to what you sort of described, and we were just talking about how much what we were what we want to talk about, we have certain kind of points of contact specifically about the idea of the unmade. So what I want to raise is a sort of discussion around sort of two central concepts in John's book, Withdrawal and the Unmade, and to show a couple of images that just briefly sort of say a few things about them and then sort of keep them on. Perhaps in the larger sort of discussion we can say more about them, try to read them. But before I get to those two sort of concepts, I have to sort of go through a couple of things, and some a little bit sort of polemic, some my own, some really, I think, trying to sort of put John's work into a certain kind of context. So one thing that I myself have enjoyed as a sort of fan is to sort of see how readers of this book have been sort of compelled to go back to John's first book, Logic of the Lure. So if you haven't read this book, just leave now and just go buy this book. You know, it's a tremendous sort of like work. And one thing that I was thinking about the similarities in these two works is the kind of attentiveness or particular kind of theoretical archive. And John, in a recent essay of his called The Art of the Consummate Cruise, he says, who in sort of queer theory now would read Heidegger, Derrida, Nancy? And it's an open question, it's an important one. And it's not sort of put out as a kind of quasi sort of like elitist sort of like statement. I think when we hear that sometimes that's what people sort of very wrongly sort of read. There's a very particular sort of attentiveness there in these sort of thinkers to a displacement of notions of identity, of sociality, of community. As you said, the idea of sort of queer neutrality is something that seems to be almost completely impossible even to sort of consider on the kind of social, political, ethical sort of level at this sort of like point. And this is also the kind of archive that sort of actually informs the kind of queer theoretical work that emerged out of the late 80s and the early sort of 90s, and that John is very much in conversation with, particularly on the work of William Haver and Leo Bersani's sort of extended sort of like work Both of these sort of thinkers trying to sort of read and to write about the queerness of relationality and arrangement, ultimately. And I believe Bersani is coming on the 4th, right?
On Monday, yes.
Monday, right. So I would say for Nancy, certainly for Haver, who's using Nancy's sort of language in his work, and Bersani, there's a kind of concentration on the finitude of singularity. And again, the singularity as opposed to identity. And this is particularly sort of significant. It's to sort of not to sort of think that queerness is reducible to the sociological unit of an I, of an identity that's recognizable by others. Quite the opposite, that's already sort of like a site of dispersion, of strangeness, of abandonment. So I think one sort of interesting sort of like symptom in sort of queer studies through the humanities and through humanistic sort of social sciences is that there have been a variety of important sort of critical turns. So critical turns to, let's say, to life, to affect, to the body, to various kinds of materialisms, to the animal, to the non-human. All these are very important, quite sort of complex and interesting turns. What they all sort of share, I would sort of like say, is a certain kind of distance, or if I were to be actually sort of less generous, let's say a certain kind of allergy to critique and theory. Because of certain kind of idea that sort of like theory sort of stands for a disengaged, distant sort of like subject that has a particular kind of purview over the world that is already there. I think that the way in which sort of John in this sort of book is trying to think about withdrawal, the unmade, and retreat is to think theoretically, which is to say theory is actually an abandonment entirely of that kind of ostensible sort of like privilege, and that it's on the side of an unmaking, ultimately. And I'll say a little bit more on that when we look at some of the images I'm going to put on. Why is this sort of significant in terms of trying to sort of think of how these different kinds of turns themselves are perhaps trying to distance themselves from theory? There is sort of like a premise in these various sort of turns that there's a kind of proper ground from where we can sort of constitute ourselves and from where a certain kind of knowledge can be taken. So we think that we know that life, let's say, is a certain kind of concept that is there for all of us. In fact, if we were to think sort of theoretically, we would think of, let's say, the fact that the idea of sort of life is entirely sort of inscribed with the idea of non-life or the unlived. And when John is sort of thinking about the unmade, it's, as he sort of says, it's not to sort of think of these as merely, let's say, images of bodies that have left a scene, but quite the opposite, that these are images that are unlived. They are not experiences that are of our lived experience. The strangeness of thinking of something like sex as unlived itself. Or to put it even more sort of starkly, what would it mean for us not to be looking at the bed, but the bed is actually looking at you? I mean, that's actually quite sort of like queer. Another sort of interesting sort of important sort of connection here is the one between aesthetics and ethics then. And you were just alluding to this a little bit, sort of, Stacey, when you're talking about sort of the issue of ground. So John begins the book by talking about groundlessness through Nancy. And so he's quoting Nancy here, who says, "The art of standing, what permits in general having or maintain a standing in, including and especially where there's no longer any support, a firm basis for whatever stance there is." And Stacey just said that freedom is already there. And I would maybe sort of add that maybe it's not freedom as it is perhaps a certain kind of unfreedom, in a kind of groundlessness. So Nancy is interested in thinking about the aesthetic as a kind of groundlessness, a space of a certain kind of withdrawal, a kind of separation and distance, and a kind of extinguishment. And so John sort of wants us to sort of think about how is something like that kind of aesthetic preoccupation, how does that map onto a particular kind of ethical claim? And this is not a kind of merely an ethics of the other, but it would be to sort of think about something like an ethics beyond ethics, which is an ethics that has no ethos that can ground it. Or to put it sort of otherwise, we can think of a certain kind of aesthetic or an ethics, which is tries to respond to the present, but is not reducible to the circumstances of the present. And that's particularly, I think, important, interesting sort of possibility that the artworks that John's reading at give us to consider. Can we show some of them, please? So,
There's the
okay.
Sophie Carl.
And again, these are, I just want to sort of give them to you as possibly sort of entering into the discussion sort of like afterwards. Two of these John talks about, and the third I threw in as I think is an interesting sort of comparison. So this is the French artist photographer Sophie Calle, and writer actually. And this is from an exhibit from, was it 2005, I think, called Exquisite Pain. And this particular show was sort of like based on the, for her, traumatic sort of like aftermath of a relationship that had gone south. And so the exhibit was in two parts, and what you're seeing are two photographs and texts from the second part. And what she had done was she paired her own sort of photograph of the bed infinitely, but it was paired with different photographs that she had sort of taken of different kinds of locations, and the text was sort of imprinted on linen. And John sort of mentions here that Sophie Calle is an artist, for example, that Rosalind Krauss has supported quite sort of extensively, and Krauss sort of describes this work, or what's interesting about Cal's sort of like work is the emphasis on technical support, in the sense that what she's interested in is what is sort of like the medium that seems to sort of like underwrite minimally the work. She describes it, I think, in a very interesting sort of way as kind of like the wall of a swimming pool that your foot has to sort of like push off of in order to make a lap. And for her, photojournalism is what Sophie Calle, that's her technical sort of like support. John sort of reads this image, or rather he reads Krauss on the image, who says that this is a work of unhappiness. And he says, this is not a work of unhappiness, this is a work of sex. I mean, totally, right? I mean, get on with it, really.
They're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, well. And what I found sort of interesting about this, and the discussion is very sort of brief, but alongside the Gonzalez-Torres, for example, image, what is Sophie Calle sort of doing here? There's a kind of sequentiality to these photographs or installation, which is quite sort of like interesting, and the kind of emphasis on that sort of bed as a kind of traumatic moment there that is both sort of like a reminder, but also kind of like the void for the kind of narrative that she is trying to sort of like produce. It's a narrative that is, I think, sort of tied to a certain kind of self-narration. And in some way, I sort of wonder whether or not that kind of move from unhappiness to sex is actually something that she's actually trying to think through, but think through a kind of erasure, meaning that unhappiness, oddly, in these sort of images, perhaps, is only possible because there is no sex. As opposed to sort of the Gonzalez-Torres, if we can just return to that for a moment.
We have to go that way.
Yeah. So again, Stacey was just talking about this quite eloquently. So we know that the Unmade Bed was, Gonzalez-Torres did a series of sort of billboards in '91 in New York. And this is a very sort of different sort of understanding of that sort of concept of the unmade, or what is constantly being subject to a kind of process of unmaking. So think of it, these sort of like billboards are in various kinds of urban spaces throughout the city, utterly sort of like anonymous, bearing ostensible imprints of bodies. But as John has sort of taught us, it's not they bear sort of imprints of bodies, but they are sites of a withdrawal already. And to sort of think of them as images of the erotic, of sort of like pleasure in its separation, in its withdrawal, in its retreat. What would that sort of possibly sort of mean? there's a certain kind of sort of criticism, I think many of us are sort of familiar around sort of González Torres, which often sort of reads him as instantly foldable into certain kinds of narratives around HIV and AIDS. I don't say that to discount that, quite the opposite, to sort of push on that. But I do push against sort of the argument to think that that in some way means that these images have to be read elegically or mournfully. I just think that's wrong. And if you were to read them elegically, what that means is you ascribe to the fact that there was an identity in that bed that had died, and you mourn that particular identity, and you mourn the sex that is gone with that body. If you were to read these images through, or rather this image I should say, through John's lens, quite the opposite. If it is an image that still has us think about HIV/AIDS, it's precisely to sort of think about the certain kinds of the erotics of withdrawal, of separation, of distance, of intimacy and proximity that are sort of specific to thinking about the virus and about sexuality. It's not about the consolidation of identities, but quite the opposite. It's about a kind of groundlessness that this bed already in some way is imaging. And again, the anonymity of it is quite intriguing. It's itself becomes a kind of very cruisy sort of image that's throughout the city, right? It's sort of like beckoning you into what could be ostensibly there. I mean, the bed is cruising you ultimately. And so the final one, and this is the fucked up cruisy bed. Okay, this is the Tracy Emin, my bed.
Right.
There's this line from Nancy's Being Singular Plural, which sounds like actually a great sort of gloss on the Emin installation. What counts in art, he says, is access to the scattered origin and its very scattering. So, as many of you know, this is installation that Emin did in '98, I believe. It was shortlisted for the Turner Prize and became obviously a huge sort of like scandal. So we know more about the scandal than the actual work, and the way that he sort of described it, it came after a period of a massive sort of emotional sort of like breakdown. She was suicidal and spent 4 days in bed, and all this crap had sort of piled up like in that bed, and hence she recreated that as a work. So much of this sort of reaction to it has been, I think, popularly quite sort of like effective, disgust, disinterest, outright sort of misogyny and sex-phobic. What I find sort of interesting about the Emin piece, and this really sort of came after reading John's very sort of sustained sort of attentiveness to this very concept, is that what Emin sort of gives is oddly the other side here of the unmade, which is the unmade is something which actually sort of refuses your glance at all. And let me sort of put it to you sort of like in this way. In Emin, the bed is a kind of unbecoming, but in that sense, its scandalousness is not that it's merely sort of like ugly. If you're to say that, that's a kind of aesthetic sort of judgment. It's as if sort of like Emin is trying to sort of suggest that she has no interest at all in such aesthetic judgment whatsoever. In that you can't sort of go up to this sort of like piece and read it already as a kind of like subject that in some way is trying to, through a disinterested sort of like point of view, trying to interpret it, trying to sort of like read it. Not that you shouldn't, but there's something in that very gesture. And I think this is sort of like the odd sort of queerness of it that she sort of demolishes. She has you sort of look at a work which is a collection of things. It's rubbish, it's waste, but none of it is actually sort of quite sort of like mournful at all. It's not as if this is merely kind of like the summary of a kind of wasted sort of like life on her sort of part. You're made to be in some way sort of aware of how much you are inhabiting a certain kind of relationality with the thingliness of sex in this image. It's famously what critics had objected to were that it had condoms in it, the various kind of bodily secretions. The idea that quite sort of like phobically that you could not or would not sort of expect to enter into those kind of relations was itself sort of scandalous. I would sort of turn it the other way around and say it's not that you're entering into the space that Emmons sort of creates, but rather that what Emmons already sort of anticipates is that that object has already incorporated us into it as well. So the refuse of it, the actual sort of like rubbish, gives us, let's say, various kinds of adjacencies then between these kinds of things that bear absolutely no synthesis, a kind of withdrawal and a refusal of entry, except for a kind of personal experience that is so personal, in the sense sort of paradoxical, that it can only be called affect, in the sense that it's not emotion. It's not your sense of what that particular structure is. Quite the opposite. It is sort of like affect, let's say in a kind of like Deleuzean way, whereas it's unlived. It's not what you feel. It is something that bed. It's a kind of sensation that lives precisely in that image as a kind of unlived object. So I just want to leave those three images for a potential sort of discussion as well. But thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacques. Etienne?
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me slip in late, as it were. I've known John for quite a while, and I've always been trying to pull out of academia. And every time I see him, I kind of slip back in, no matter how hard I try to escape. And it seems that I always arrive late and unprepared. So I have no text nor images, but I've been preparing, for a serious amount of time in making scenes in the airport for the last 18 hours and trying to think what would John tell me to do to relax me in this fit of rage. And so during that time, in this awful American airport CNN blasting scenario, I started to get the sense of the comments Stacey was making, that in a way a lot of the things that I would want to say about what I have learned from John, and as a friend, as a teacher, editing together, writing together, and especially from both of his books, are becoming increasingly obscene realities, as Stacey said. And that's quite, it's an unbecoming experience, and not in the way I think that we would prefer to have it. So I'm just going to make three remarks, to not take a lot of time stuttering. But recently I wrote to John from Indonesia, where I've been in the last 3 years, and I'm being there quite readily unmade by the tropics. The effect of tropical light on white men can be very severe and maddening, as many of you know. And so in this unmaking, I wrote to John quite recently that, in fact, the decision between us is a book that I would kind of keep pulling down from the shelf to just calm myself down some days, to just read a little bit as a sort of relationship both with John and with the text. And I think one of the reasons that I continually do that is that it's such an exemplary book, in that it doesn't make or ask or offer any vague imperatives. And I think you say this as well. I've perhaps just out of frustration or becoming sort of more curmudgeon-y as I get older, I find that as I read political theory and people tell me who should do what and why we should and must, I've become increasingly disinclined to keep reading. And I think what's so remarkable about the decision between us and about the logic of the lure is that it's already there. Our thinking is just not yet tuned to the realities which we believe are absent. And I would say, Stacey said this as a kind of shift in perspective. And I would say it's I would even say maybe a bit more than that for me, where in Daybreak, Nietzsche suggests that he makes this very, very beautiful remark that we need to learn to think differently so that perhaps later we will also learn to feel differently. And I think the conceptual affective loop of thought and relation that John creates, that allows, as you're reading that experience, to not only think differently, but to feel differently about what you think, and to think differently about what you feel, is one of the more remarkable achievements of this text in particular. The second thing that I would say, and I apologize that this is really nowhere near as polished as the previous remarks, but quite personal in a way, is that I feel like the book is also exemplary in that it is centrifugal away from the book. That the book is never really the focus of the book, although it is so precise. And so in the epigraph from Maurice Blanchot, the book is not, there is no book. The book is just the activity of trying to release and articulate a conceptual and affective relationship. The book is a holding pattern that can be shared between us. And I think what's so remarkable is that the exquisite care put into that holding pattern at the same time recognizes that it's just that. It's just a holding pattern. The work is in the relay, and that the book as the object is simply a placeholder or a holding pattern to be moved on to and from. And so the third remark that I would say is that my relationship to the book is that the decision between us is also, I feel, a fragmentation of myself as a reader and a thinker and a writer, and that the us is also a referent to the I. Do I keep reading? Should I stop reading? Have I gone far enough? Am I closer or further away from what I was trying to understand in the beginning of this? And there is a procedure through the reading from the writer that in a way is similar to the erasure of the de Kooning drawing. You feel John's eraser against you, eroding some of the things which you're trying to think back against him. And I feel that that's also a very rare experience to encounter as a reader, and one that I aspire to, but have certainly come nowhere near as a writer. And so one of the most remarkable unbecomings that I feel I would like to end on is that in the last 4 or 5 years, a lot of the work and publishing that I've done has been in relation to the Anthropocene thesis. And maybe, I don't know, there was maybe 100 or 700 conferences about the Anthropocene this year. Between that number, I think a few disciplines have escaped it thus far. Maybe physical education. Yes, it has. Okay, but that, and maybe 1 or 2 others. But there is this remarkable and incredible repetition in this discourse about the we. Who are we that must say we? I mean, basically, that's every Anthropocene discussion that's occurred in the last 5 years. And so there is an incredible hesitancy to discuss any we that is projective, any we that is constitutive, any we that is non-consensual, but at the same time, the we of the Anthropocene is hard to erase, hard to get rid of. It's a very thick ink. It's a very difficult procedure to remove the tendencies for species association. And so I think for me it was quite remarkable in the book that I was producing with Heather Davis on art in the Anthropocene, that we were really trying to find a way to incline some of the other artists and thinkers to reframe that question. And I think shared separation may be one of the most fundamentally significant ethical propositions that we relay by reading John in the introduction of that book. And so I did have the very amazing privilege to launch this book with John in Los Angeles a while ago. And the best part about it was that he read a little bit, you know. So I was going to just read that first text, but but you're here, so then you can just read this part, because you'll see when he reads it that this separation, this way of but you're slow, the way that you do it. That
Nice and slow.
nice and slow, because the question, the really fundamental difficulty of both reflecting on this impossible identity-laden neutrality, and at the same time the impossible collectivity which is trying to navigate it, I feel like there's really very little room for maneuvering and very little room for flourishing in a way, and that this for me has been such a fundamental way out of the impasse of the Anthropocene discourse. So I prepared it for you, if you can just the first, the part of, just because.
Separation is the spacing of existence, and is, by definition, never solitary but always shared. It is what affirms that for anything to exist, there must be more than one thing, each one separated from each other one, together partaking in the spacing between that is opened up by separation. Existence, therefore, is relational and shared, and hence is always to be understood as coexistence. Not the coming together of solitary and autonomous beings, but existence as sharing or partaking in separation as the there is of existence, the spacing there of being together. If separation is the spacing of existence, and if existence is always relational and shared, then sharing in separation is the praxis of coexistence, of being together.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Etienne. Thank you very much. So we'll now listen to Tom from afar.
Yeah, let's see.
I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in person tonight, but I want to thank John for the very kind invitation to come and join the symposium and join my colleagues in thinking about his new book, The Decision Before Us, a text that I find has been occupying a good deal of my thought in these past several months. I guess for me, at the core of the book is really this unresolvable paradox encapsulated in his term of a shared separation. This notion that being is always a being together. And for me, who approaches this as an art historian, not as a philosopher or critical theorist, I suppose the way I understand it is this idea that the subject cannot be thought of as an autonomous monad, but is engaged in a sharing or a partaking of the world that's necessarily also a sustaining of that space entailed in separation. I mean, it's the paradox, I guess, contained in the French verb partager, which means both to share and to divide or to split. A simultaneity of opposites that's harder to grasp in the English sharing, I suppose. Although if you think of the notion of sharing and sharing out, you get something closer to the French partager. Now, I suppose in the critical tradition in which I most often work, separation has highly pejorative implications. Right? For someone who's spent many years thinking through the work of Guy Debord and the Situationist International, separation has a very particular set of meanings. I mean, for Debord, certainly, the spectacle commodity economy operates precisely to atomize and divide human assemblages, right? Assemblages that might otherwise prove dangerous to a dominant order. The spectacle is, as Debord subtitles one of the subsections of his classic 1967 text. I mean, the spectacle is separation perfected. Right? And in Debord's eyes, the cultural form of the cinema was an almost perfect analogy for that notion of a spectacular separation. For him, we could almost say it was a veritable technology of isolation. And here, you could think in particular, let's say, of the opening segment of his final and probably greatest film, In Girum imus nocte et consumimur igni, filmed in 1978, released in 1981. The film opens on a shot in which the theater audience confronts an image of itself on the screen. It's a still shot of spectators seated quietly in their seats, facing forward, watching the film, with the projector beaming behind them. It's almost as if the screen has turned into a mirror before us, right? And we watch ourselves watching. We see reflected back our passivity as spectators, right? In Deboer's terms, let's say. And that mirrorical return, if I can take up a Duchampian notion, right? That return is emphasized in Deboer's voiceover. Right? Part of which reads, he says, today, scheming advertisers, with all the cynicism expected from those who know that people are inclined to justify an insult they do not avenge, that they refuse to avenge or cannot avenge, scheming advertisers calmly declare that when you love life, you go to the movies. But this life and these movies both amount to very little, and hence they may indeed be exchanged the one for the other with indifference. Right? That phrase, when you love life, you go to the movies. Quand on aime la vie, on va au cinéma. That was a advertising slogan popular through the whole 1970s. It was propagated by the Centre National du Cinéma in France as a response, let's say, an alarmed response maybe, to declining box office returns, people turning to television away from going to see the films. Truffaut probably hijacked that same slogan more succinctly than Deboer, right? Truffaut, who famously said in the 1970s, kind of reversing its meaning, when you hate life, you go to the movies, right? For Deboer, let's say, the cinema audience was the epitome of separation. Separated from the action on the screen, separated from each other in the theater, separated from life itself. And here, even though I've, let's say, frequently been resistant to these kinds of comparisons, it's really hard for us not to think of a long tradition of suspicion of representation. One that, a relay that might go from Deboer back to Rousseau in his famous letter to D'Alembert on the theater, all the way back to its Platonic origins in an allegory of the cave, let's say, right? But I think that there is a strong Rousseauian element here, or almost like a reverse of Rousseau, in which the Rousseau for whom the festival was this celebration of transparency, in which the crowd, the people, confronts itself with open hearts. In a sense, Deboer's opening to In Girum depicts the obverse of that. Yes, the audience sees itself, but not in this transparent form, rather in the form of an utter opacity. I mean, Deboerdian cinema, amongst other things, constitutes nothing other than a set of Brechtian strategies, precisely for breaking that mirrorical return, breaking the naturalness of this spectatorial position, breaking this separation, breaking the mirror itself. We could put it in other terms. As Roland Barthes wrote just a few years earlier, a few years before Deboer's final film, Barthes formulated what he called a set of strategies for coming unglued from the mirror of the screen. This is something he discusses in a short text I want to dwell on with you, his 1975 essay, Leaving the Movie Theater. Like Deboer, Barthes sees cinema as profoundly aligned with a particular class order. He writes, "The image captivates me, captures me. I am glued to the representation, and it is this glue that establishes the naturalness, the pseudo-nature of the filmed scene." Actually, has not the image statutorily all the characteristics of the ideological? The historical subject, like the cinema spectator I am imagining, is also glued to ideological discourse. He experiences its coalescence, its analogical security, its naturalness, its truth. It is a lure. I mean, for Barthes, ideology, in the end, is nothing less than what he calls the cinema of a society. Right? But that fascination can be broken, the glue loosened, by developing the tools of critical vision, right? Arming oneself with the discourse of counter-ideology. I mean, that's one path that Barthes outlines in a way not very distant from Debord, of course, and from Brecht before him. I mean, and certainly that's the path that an early Barthes undertook in the 1950s with the essays of Mythologie, for example. But the originality of the 1975 text, the originality of leaving the movie theater, lies in another tactic. It lies elsewhere. Not to break the fascination or lure, but rather to exacerbate it. To be fascinated, as he says, twice over. That is, not only by the image on the screen itself, by that screen mirror, but also by its surroundings. The hall, the darkness, the obscure mass of other bodies, the rays of light, entering the theater, leaving the hall. What Barthes sums up as a perverse relation to the cinema. And that, I think, returns us to the notion of a shared separation in what Roland Barthes calls not a scene, as John terms it, but rather a situation. I mean, to be hypnotized, Barthes says, by an amorous distance, by what he tentatively calls a possible bliss of discretion. And he says, I mean that term in its etymological sense. And discretion, as we'll recall, derives from the Latin discretio, precisely separation. And here, Roland Barthes sketches the outlines of just that queer sociality that's at the core of John's subject. I'll just read a brief paragraph from Barthes' essay. What does the darkness of the cinema mean? Not only is the dark the very substance of reverie, it's also the color of a diffused eroticism. By its human condensation, by its absence of worldliness, by the relaxation of postures, the movie house is a site of availability, even more than cruising, the inoccupation of bodies, which best defines modern eroticism, not that of advertising or striptease, but that of the big city. It is in this urban dark that the body's freedom is generated. This invisible work of possible affects emerges from a veritable cinematographic cocoon. The movie spectator could easily appropriate the silkworm's motto, inclusum labor illustrat. It is because I am enclosed that I work and glow with all my desire. Debord, for all the time that he spent inside theaters, for all of his contradictory cinephilia, seems to have remained curiously uninterested in this eroticization of the space of cinema. I mean, the audience for him, could be subject to shock, but never sexual temptation. I mean, boundaries could be transgressed, but only in the direction of aggression, never seduction. I mean, here, the Situationists were profoundly indebted to the kinds of cinematographic scandals, loved of the Surrealists and the Lettrists after them, throwing smoke bombs into the audience, disrupting normative modes of viewing. but never in the direction of an eroticization. Which is not to say that De Boer's cinema was entirely free of a certain queerness. I mean, the homosociality of some of his motifs, a sailor from Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin, Sterling Hayden from Johnny Guitar, those motifs, certainly could carry a strong erotic charge. But that was always articulated in terms of a narcissism of the image, not a perversion of the cinematic space itself. All of these brief reflections may be just a way of saying how productive the decision between us proves to be as a text. I mean, a book that manages not simply to make us see its own subjects differently, an erased drawing by Rauschenberg, an installation of Felix Gonzalez Torres, but one that allows us to approach our own presuppositions anew. I think thanks to John, we can pose a new set of questions to our objects and are provided with a new set of tools to employ in answering them. And for that, I think we all, but certainly I myself, owe him a tremendous debt of gratitude. Thanks for letting me join you tonight.
Wonderful. Well, we've got a lot on the table, and what I'd like to do is begin by inviting our panelists to talk to each other for a few minutes before handing over to the audience, where I expect there are all sorts of questions as well. So let me begin by turning to the panelists and asking for your thoughts and questions.
Well, you had brought this up, and obviously it's central to the book. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about the neutrality or the neutral.
Yeah. As I said, I'm really not a fluent speaker of theory, but I have read The Neutral, and this book, John's book, actually, certainly kept taking me back to The Neutral, and to that. I almost feel like The Neutral is sort of Barth's unbuilt project. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And in what you were saying, what I was thinking about that also kind of takes us back to The Neutral is this feeling that when you were talking about the strangeness, right? Queer strangeness, the bed is cruising you, all of that. I was thinking about how it's as if there was a space that queer opened up, but then actually no one wants to be queer. Mm-hmm. No one wants to be neutral, so it's very interesting to me to see John open that space up and sort of work in that space, and to sort of assert that neutrality is actually already with us, right? Mm-hmm. But the neutral feels difficult to. It feels like a difficult space to claim, I guess. Mm-hmm. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, and you mentioned sort of Sartori, and you certainly know this, that there's a moment when he says it's kind of like a voiding of the mind, like one sort of way of thinking about it, and I'm sort of reminded of Blanchot sort of thinking about sort of like the neutral, and what's interesting is, just as a side about sort of like the book, is how much sort of like John you queer Blanchot, and you rendered Barth queer by sort of reading sort of the neutral through Blanchot, meaning to say that sort of think of Barth actually sort of very much involved in that, as opposed to sort of thinking of these discourses as having a certain, as being parallel but somewhat sort of different in their preoccupations. And your argument is quite the opposite. There is a certain kind of not a certain kind, but there is a very important sort of trajectory there. But you said we would not want to sort of become sort of queer, but we would be sort of like open to various kind of sensations or forces or strange kind of temporal or spatial sort of like disturbances themselves, that have, are obviously not about sort of identity, but there are about certain kind of displacement and a kind of going through sort of like the subject to sort of almost look away and put the subject in its place. And you could only have, in this book, an image of an unmade bed, because to offer anything else, after all, would be sort of to concede that you could sort of like affirm a concept that is seemingly impossible. And another sort of like level, I can't remember if he must have meant talk about this, but I can't remember if it's explicitly so. If you sort of remember this on sort of like war and the neutral, just the sheer sort of like unthinkability of a kind of neutral space.
It's
now.
impossible.
Right.
It's impossible. I mean, that's the thing that really kind of breaks my heart, is that we're conscripted. We're always already conscripted. I mean, the war is on, and that's. I mean, and even now, it still carries a tremendous charge when Barth says, "I wish to be exempted from meaning as from military service," or that idea of his whole thing about the twinklings. It's still astonishingly radical, and getting more radical by the minute, really.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, identity has become it's stronger than it ever was, right? And it's as if way back in the ancient days of queer meant to queer things, to queer it, to make it strange, and then it kind of, and it's become reduced to, it's really just gotten folded into identity, and so I don't know I'm a little stymied by that, honestly.
Well, the quote is it's amazing. It's an exemption from military service.
From military service,
and it's the description of, let's say, the neutral in its if that's a kind of social political sort of understanding of the neutral. Barth sort of has us think about the formalism of the neutral, but embedded within that is, or encrypted within this, is a different kind of sort of discourse.
Yeah. It's a completely different kind of discourse, and I mean, what I love about John's book is that he's. You were talking about the archive, right? Is that he's finding, he's talking about these things that are there. They're in the archive. They're right. He's not saying, let's go and make this. He's saying this is actually here. And I thought that I loved your reading of that unmade bed, because of course, I mean, to think of that on billboards in the 90s, of course you think of HIV, right? Mm-hmm. But I love that reading of saying, like, well, that's not all of it, right? It's not reducible to that point. It's about the erotics of that withdrawal. It's about that's fantastic.
Because there's a way that to sort of read it as reducible to HIV and AIDS is to already sort of say that both of those are in some way, they're a part of life, but it's so perverse to think of it.
Yeah.
That the idea that a viral life is something so different from life that you have to be shocked into by seeing it as a billboard. Yeah. Whereas the image, oddly, with its own, let's say, technical support, does the reverse, which is that this is not outside of life. This is what you think life could be, and ultimately it's something that's impossibly there. Yeah. And yet it is, put it differently, it is impossible to grasp it. Yeah. But you are in it anyway. Yeah. And in some way, there's a kind, let's say, life would then itself be neutral. Yeah. As a concept.
But I think that there's a more. I mean, I think withdrawal and retreat are not brought out as passivities. They're an active and a engaged element, and so I think what is really one of the achievement of neutrality is not mobilizing the archive, is not trying to reconsume cultural artifacts for the purpose of then upcycling them into theory. No. And so I think that this because it's a time of scenes, not a space. And so the temporality, the temporal element of neutrality is to basically take cultural artifacts and cultural products and give them a space for thought and articulation that isn't mobilizing them into a new campaign.
Yeah,
and I
yeah.
think that this is much closer to Blanchot and Siorin to say that as soon as we say this is, we're going to
Yeah,
protect
yeah.
the thing,
Yeah.
we're just amplifying the machine. The more we engage
Yeah.
with the campaign, we just animate further mobilizations of this
Yeah,
this,
yeah.
this war terrain.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't think any of us are calling for like, let's make sure that neutrality as a brand is. Do you know what I mean? We're not like, let's launch neutrality.com, right? I mean, the art. I mean, it
I've
seemed to me
got
that
it
that I mean, I take your point, but it seemed in talking about the artifacts. I mean, the cultural things that John is talking about. That's like the stuff we can see. Do you know what I mean? That's the stuff that we can look at to say, here are some places wherein we can talk about that position. We can talk about the decision between us. But I don't think that I wasn't saying let's that he's upcycled.
But I think it's a really fun, and I'm not disagreeing with you. I just think it's it's an incredibly fine granularity to say that we will hold in neutrality objects that we care about as things, as technologies and sensualities to think with, without then facilitating the mobilization of those things into a different register. And so the withdrawal from that logic
Yeah.
of saying let's take these things and put them as the front line,
Yeah.
the fundamental act of doing that is what I understand John to be defining as ethical.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just that granularity always threatens to start to cascade into a mobilization.
Yeah.
Because of the things in politics
Yeah.
that we both find abhorrent that threaten the book. But this is what I think is so interesting, that the threats to the logic that John's describing may not be best contested by mobilizing against them.
Right. I think Bart would agree.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think.
But mobilizing to what? Like, what? I'm sort of interested. Like, what do you mean by kind of frontline or sort of a campaign? Do you mean sort of like the taking certain kinds of cultures, sort of like objects, and then sort of like assimilating them to kind of like a rhetoric of like identity, of monumentalization, of like, what do you mean by those terms?
Well, the immobilization is both the preparation for a military campaign, right? It's like getting the stuff ready. It's a consumptive logic. But it's also, I think, in contemporary theory, what happens to the artworks. They're mobilized into theoretical constellations for the purpose of making a political or ethical agenda stand up. And I think that's why John is laying in the bed. It's not propping, it's not trying to stand up the works, to prop up a position. It's to be unmade with them, right?
Well, I mean, what I would disagree with is that, and sort of given sort of the theoretical sort of archive that's that John is sort of drawing on, I would say that it's a kind of weak theory or weak sort of theoretical approaches or weak sort of writing that would look on, let's say, these kinds of, at the very least, let's say these three sort of images that are here, and sort of appropriate them in some way as being expressive of or like objective correlates of a certain kind of idea or a certain kind of position. Because if I think of certainly sort of Nancy or sort of Derrida sort of like relying on the aesthetic, and sort of Blanchot and Barthes, for whom it's very much that kind of what you sort of, as you sort of describe it, as almost a kind of like a walking away, ultimately. That's a very different kind of, it's not mobilization certainly. It's
deserting.
It's a kind of deserting of a kind of
Yeah.
interesting capacity. Has I think it's in the Neutral, his great sort of line where he says to his class, he says, we're going to deal with the unsustainable for a couple of weeks, and then that's it. It's finished. You know? And I think maybe sort of the other term, if it's more sort of forceful here, next to sort of withdrawal and retreat, would be like the unsustainable, to push that in as well, how that sort of like works also.
And to make a case for unsustainability, rather than we're schooled into now so anxiously into a so-called sustainable life, I guess is a way of exempting us from life, which is to say from the warring domination of the concept of life, to which all politics and ethics are compelled to be answerable. To think about an unsustainable and unlived ethics, to think of the possibility of an unsustainable and unlived aesthetics. Mm-hmm. It strikes me that those are some of the things that flow from John's book. That among the many things to stand back from or walk away from, maybe the most difficult thing of all to walk away from would be life, or a certain conception of life, a certain putting to use of life.
A mobilization of life in this logic, I think I know in Canada everything's a really happy, liberal, get along gang again, and there's no problems here. But after 18 hours of CNN in the airport on my way over, I can tell you, just over there, these mobilizations have become quite fanatical. I mean, to a point of, for most people, completely, inconceivably terrifying. And so, but all, again, precisely, at least in the last 7 days or so, around the conception of life. That this is the fundamental mobilizing ideology of...
Oh, do you mean the whole abortion thing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Of that, like, this is inconceivable to me. I mean, but when I think that is precisely, I think maybe John and Bill Haver and a few others are the few people who have articulated that language of withdrawal not as even withdrawal presupposes some sort of giving up. Our language is still filled with the baggage of positivity. That then all of those withdrawals, negation, retreat, they're all conceived of. But to bring withdrawal and retreat into the neutral, I think that's the most difficult work, right? That it's not a walking away from life. How could we give up on this life? Right. Yeah.
To make a case for less life, not more life.
I think it's about an ethics and maybe a politics of withdrawing or retreating into an originary retreat and withdrawal that is the condition, that originary retreat of existence outside of the paradigm of life and the sort of combat that is generated out of that, because life is so wedded to a notion of preservation. That's the campaign that we're talking about, and really what we're talking about.
Life is what exposes us to the violence of the law.
Exactly, and instead, we need an ethics and a politics that turns us over to the destitution of life, which is, as you say, Stacey, already there as the condition of existence. We are abandoned into existence from out of life as some kind of sacred, ontological, biological, whatever substance or condition, and to that we are rendered in order to, the phrase is suffer existence, that is endure, not necessarily in a negative, but in the sense of undergo this kind of, right, and it's a suffering and an enduring, because they're really, regardless of whatever kinds of technologies and apparatuses and means by which we think we have come to support and preserve and that life, keep it on life support, there is nothing that will ever truly, preserve it, keep it, which is the question of the archive. There's always going to be that loss, because we are, as singular existent beings, rendered destitute and abandoned to our finitude, to that fact. So it's, I think it's that kind of, existence outside of life is existence confronting and sustaining the very fact of the finitude that we share in common. That's really where the kind of ethics and politics might lie.
I wondered, John, I'd like to push that just a little bit.
Okay.
And Etienne very graciously asked you to read that opening. That's a marvelous opening, unforgettable opening paragraph in the book. And I always tell my undergraduates, pay attention to what happens at the end of a text, but it reminds me how important it is to pay attention at the beginning as well. But there's a way in which that opening moves sets a certain is the kind of a scene in which being is the question, Seinsfrage, the question at hand. But there are lots and lots of other places in the book where being becomes the existent. And I'm not sure that they're the same thing. In other words, it just is kind of extension of the question of lifelessness. To think lifelessness to the end would be to abandon even the notion of finitude, insofar as finitude is associated with mortality, with a living, with the radical and passive exposure of a living thing to its own demise. So I see in the book this kind of slippage would be too strong a word, but there is a kind of restlessness in which there's a way in which there's an ontology in the book, which is withdrawn from the question of existence and of mortality, and then there is something else other than an ontology, something that is about living things, about the exposed nature of living things. One thing strikes me as more life, about life, and the other thing is, to me, about less life. Lifeless being, the lifelessness of everything that is in its relationship to everything that it is not, that decision, the decidings that make one thing different from another thing, it strikes me as describing a realm to the side of a realm of living things.
Yeah, I would have to say first that it's kind of funny that we're talking about life, because it's not really a concept for me, or certainly not in that book, but
I'm suggesting spectrally that is it possible that it is? Yeah. In the emphasis on finitude, mortal exposure.
I think you could sort of see that maybe. What sort of comes to mind is thinking about the Gonzalez-Torres chapter alongside the Balt chapter, where obviously, because these are two completely different, discrete aesthetic objects, the Balt chapter, one has a sense of the photograph as such, like formally. The way you sort of read it is like it almost like exists. It could not exist even with a spectator, in the same way as there's only kind of like a neutral mourning. Whereas, of course, the Gonzalez-Torres, it requires a certain kind of participation performance. There's no way around that. So it requires minimally living things for it to occur. But that just comes to mind as, again, like two kind of objects there.
It's a good question.
I don't think the question of death is ever posed as in relationship to a strong concept of life. that's actually maybe it's not posed as if it's the answer to some ontological question or some life question in the sort of contemporary vitalist excitement around multi-species efflorescence.
I mean, it strikes me that the pressure, as slight as it is, that I feel in the book, and after all, this is a book that it is a kind of a classroom in the slightest of pressures, like to be cognizant of those, to respond to the slightest of pressures, and it strikes me that there is this slight pressure in the book to think of singularity as living singularities. And that's intriguing to me. To me, that's not a fault. That just suggests the fact that it's very, very difficult to exempt oneself or be exempted from military service. From that it's for Bart it's I want to do this. It's a desire. But whether or not one can, that's another question.
But I mean, don't you think Bart? I mean, he knew that the image could not be exempted from social. Do you know what I mean? He was talking about something that is not possible, right? And that it would only be sort of like in these twinkling. I just love the fayness of twinklings. It's like that's just so hilarious. But it's like he knew that you could just like twinkle it for a minute, right? It's impossible. The image to exempt the image from meaning as from social military. I mean, good luck. You can't. But it's as if it could sort of, and again, it's a perspective. It's perspective that you can see it exempted from its for a twinkling, and then it's going to get collapsed back again. I mean, I think that I mean, I don't know. I don't have access to Bart's mind, but I think that's what he. I don't know. I think that's what he was saying. That he knew that in putting that forward, right? And that he knew what a scandalous proposition that was. I mean, to say that in France, not that long after the war, I mean, that's absolutely, it's so transgressive. And I think I think he knew that, I would say.
I don't know. I feel like again this when he says as if it could be exempted, I think again this points to this, that the exemption is not granted, that unworking is a lot of work, that the désoeuvrement is not passivity, and so if we take that idea of exemption militarily as the sort of evasion of mobilization through neutrality, I think again this is an incredible, as you said in the introduction, is incredible work of unworking. There's a lot of work to avoid working. It's very hard to avoid mobilizing. It's in fact much more work to not mobilize. And so I think that quality of exempting the image from its militarization is the work. It's the creation of the scene.
I was just reading recently about a group in Argentina, a group of mothers of sons and daughters that have been disappeared, and with the change in regimes, it becomes possible now to exhume the corpses of the dead, to find the corpses, and after all, now my understanding is their whole science is devoted to mapping and discovering the mass graves, and this group had decided that they didn't want the bodies returned, repatriated. That the mothers had said, we would rather leave the bodies disappeared than have them returned, because the feeling was that to have the bodies returned, they would be instantly made productive.
Mm-hmm.
They'd be put into the service of yet another regime, and that at any moment those corpses could be, as Goya would say, great deeds with the dead. More great deeds could be done with the dead, and that just shows you that there's a kind of real-time political group that's making these impossible decisions about the remains of their loved ones, and the sense that they're living in a warring world so total that the dead aren't safe, and so once that happens, then there is no possible exemption. If even the dead are to be put to work, and I suppose that's probably the condition of warfare generally. I'm going to wager that war was always that way, that the dead were never safe. But if that's the case for these groups of women, and it just shows you that the difficulty of withdrawing, of being, in a sense, practicing a kind of neutrality vis-a-vis the war machine. That's what that to me, trying to think of contemporary political examples. Because Etienne, I take your point that that John's book isn't a manifesto. In fact, it's a kind of it's a book against that. And it's not even a book. That's one of the things that really interests me about it. It's not actually a book, and in a way, there's a way in which it undoes itself repeatedly, and that's one of the strange and estranging effects of reading it, is that it's so delightfully, perversely not to be put to work, or put to a certain kind of work. But that being said, I do think that there are legible political and also aesthetic consequences, implications of the book.
Yeah.
Of course.
And that it sensitizes us to the possibility of certain forms of mournful neutrality, let's say, at work, politically at work. And also to sensitize us to, because I've certainly heard this this evening, that to sensitize us to the current conjuncture in which the possibility of being with rather than en route to or coming from is rendered all but impossible.
Yeah.
Never more difficult than at the current moment.
Yeah, like I remember in the immediate aftermath of the terrorist massacre in Paris, well, both of them, but I guess it was the first, the attacks on the Charlie Hebdo office. We remember that the political and seemingly, presumably ethical response was to declare, je suis Charlie and I am, right? This sort of identifying sort of political alliance. And suddenly the Facebook news feed was populated with profile portraits that had this tricolor wash over them, right? And the flag was raised again. So what I'm politically, I suppose, what I'm proposing is a different kind of response, to that, with that sense of sharing in that kind of destruction. And one of my inclinations and responses was to post on Facebook, because so it's that gesture, that form, a photo that I had taken just a few months before the Charlie Hebdo massacre of a window shade at the Sorbonne, one of these classic, many of you are probably familiar with them, sort of gray or black and white vertical striped window shades, which of course recalls now I'm going to draw a blank on his name. Daniel Biron's interventions in '68 on the streets of Paris, and so to think aesthetically and politically and ethically about the kind of neutral flag that might be raised, the way in which aesthetics offers us a way of thinking the neutral politically. And I had just been reading Michel Houellebecq's latest novel, Submission, which is precisely about how the Sorbonne becomes this Muslim university through a kind of electoral majority and takeover in France, and which gets us back to the university and gets us back to the classroom, so yes, it's clearly not the dominant response or inclination or imperative or logic, far from it, but
is it that I'm just sort of thinking what you were sort of describing and what sort of prompted you in this is that there is a certain, let's say, sort of concept that the political cannot sort of accommodate the non-relational, when in fact sort of the non-relational is entirely inscribes the political, whereas the gesture you described, for example, the hysteria around Charlie Hebdo, is in fact the recuperative gesture, is in fact that the relational aspect of it is precisely what makes it so awful and unbearable, because it has to go next. It has to in some way by a sequence proceed to some kind of form of reaction, and you sort of wonder what would another sort of action be, and you said, well, what would it mean to sort of almost impossibly raise a kind of white flag of sorts, and one sort of thing that sort of came to my mind, this was I was reading by a piece by Professor Irvine Ray Terada, and she says she's talking about the Occupy movement, and she said, well, what do you make of the claims of those in Occupy where it's not a gesture that is being read anymore as if it were towards a government official at all, or any kind of like the state. So the interpretation that Occupy was useless, etc., all that kind of rubbish. The problem with that kind of interpretation is precisely that it just assumes that its only sort of position is to be responsive to the government. And she says, well, but what if it's a reading of them as turning their backs and having a kind of conversation, difficult conversation, demands are now in a different kind of sort of space. Well, that changes things. And I'm not sure if that would be, and you can map the neutral onto it or whatever, but that is this kind of retreat, certainly, of a very important kind. Into
a new political space of belonging, we might say. Nancy's turn of phrase, which is really quite nice, is to be occupied with belonging itself. That is, starting with the fundamental need to reconstitute what it means to be together. We can't know what kinds of claims are going to be made, if they're ever going to be made, until we start to think, that the social has been so stratified and so saturated in so many ways. It's been so partitioned and so, brutally kind of pulverized to the point where we can't even be together anymore. That the first thing we need to do is figure that out, right? So to be occupied with belonging itself, per se, and then to understand that occupation, that work, really entails a commitment and devotion beyond just an acknowledgement, that belonging always means a non-relational relation. It means a shared separation. It means the fact that this is not about, it's not about permanence, it's not about teleology, it's not about identity, it's not about, it's very much about, as Haver will describe it, sort of, retracing the trajectories of that singularity's disappearance, that very fundamental fact and condition. It ends up looking like a radically different image of politics or the political, because it asks for a kind of work that the political has never been able to accept as political work.
But it could be, the title could be from Carl Schmitt, that's, I think that the decision between us has this, could be like the lost Carl Schmitt papers. but the
except the opposite.
Except the opposite, but I think that's also part of the recuperation of the decision as basically rending it out of either individual and locating it as a mode of relation is a complete undoing of the whole political concept as it's been inherited even up to Rancière.
That's right. And in that way, we would want to, in talking about something like, if we wanted to talk about something like the sovereignty of the people, we would want to turn to Bataille on sovereignty, right? Which is, again, a radically different notion of sovereignty. And as a preview, that is where my work is going these days. Certainly a large part of it is in reading Bataille along these lines.
Now, I do want to invite John to give some closing remarks tonight, but there is time, and I'm thankful for it, to ask for questions or comments from tonight's audience, and I'd be happy to entertain those. Yeah.
We returned again and again to the motif of the unmade bed that's still up here, and it struck me that we might be working with several concepts of what the term unmade or unmaking might be without necessarily attending to those differences. For instance, unmaking could be a kind of deconstruction. It could be a kind of indifference to the bodies that made or unmade it, like that. It could be a kind of temporal zone of afterness, but also not necessarily existing between two distinct things, as in a kind of phenomenology. Or it could be erasure, and as John says, erasure is never separate from drawing, so it could be a kind of drawing of the covers forward or a drawing of the covers backward. And I wonder if we could maybe attend a little more closely to that concept of unmaking. Is it completely congruent with the concept of unworking or not?
Do you want to?
No, you.
Do you want
That's for John.
Oh, no. My phrase, the one that I return to again and again, is the already unmade, which is not only supposed to be a play on Duchamp's ready-made, but is supposed to get at this sort of ontological condition, right, in which and an ontological condition that of this being with, of this shared sociality, that were not being called, but whatever, that were being entrusted to sustain through this kind of shared praxis that is very much about a commitment to affirming the degree to which the partitions and structures and so forth that I was just describing of the political and the social and so forth find their condition and their source, find their origin in this thing that's sort of certainly impossible to return to in its unmaking, and impossible to remake, impossible to claim. In my discussion of González Torres's image, I make a big point about not referring to it, not describing it as an empty bed in the way that we might describe it that way. And in that distinction between the empty and the unmade, I think lies, a huge difference in terms of how we're thinking something other than politically a conventional notion of the negative or negation or the void, either as that which one wants to produce or that which one feels the need to fill, so that if the bed is never empty, as I argue, but always unmade, always already unmade, then that means there's a kind of materiality that doesn't accord with the conventional notions of the political and the ethical, or even the work of art, the aesthetic. Meaning, to follow Jacques' lead, does not become kind of an object of judgment, a means by which you can adjudicate, right, and decide. So it's a different kind of sovereignty, a sense of sovereignty, because it's not based upon some sense of exception, but instead of a kind of always already condition, right? If that makes sense.
One thing that sort of comes to my mind, especially since you brought up again the González Torres. So last year I was at a lecture given by Jonathan Katz, who's a queer art historian, and it was called Untitled, and it was about thinking about various kinds of artworks from the late 80s and 90s that were responding to the AIDS crisis. And so he quoted González Torres, who was asked, so do you see yourself, do you want to be outside the system? And he said, no, I want to be part of the system. I want to get into all those buildings. I want to get into those corporations. I want my stuff to be in there. I do not want to lie outside of it. And so Katz's sort of reading of that was, it was a kind of almost like a viral aesthetic and a viral politics. In fact, a lot of these works that were very deliberately made to seem almost for the reasons of the marketplace, they had to go under the radar to sort of be objects that a collector would kind of want to buy. but then they would like fuck with that. Basically, it's like, oh well, this is what actually the work is doing. It's a work that's actually about HIV/AIDS, but you don't know it. And so it's the riff on the idea of a kind of that so many works are called untitled as a kind of necessity to sort of like, you know, erase entirely their kind of their specificity. A little bit what we were talking about with the Nan Golden, but also that to sort of think of the untitled and what Gonzalez Torres is doing is that it's an unmaking in the sense that if it's invested in a certain kind of praxis, then that sort of like practice is a kind of impossible sort of undoing. I think sort of in line a little bit with the way in which you're talking about the kind of unmaking.
Yeah, and the way in which that sort of goes against both a claim for a certain kind of lost historical moment, right, that we want to reclaim biographically and politically, while at the same time also resisting the notion of some kind of, in speaking ontologically, of some kind of universal that sort of lacks the sort of historicity, you know, the sort of specificity. So that's where we're at, and I think that's another way of thinking the queer and thinking the queer neutral as operating in that, you know, space of the neither nor, neither the lost historical moment that sends you down some nostalgia trip, nor, you know, the kind of universally ontological, lacking that sort of historicity. And just, you know, anecdotally, I can tell you that Felix's work appears on the cover of on the cover of my book, and thereby on the cover of a book that is not solely devoted to him, that is not a monograph on Gonzalez Torres, for the first time. Now, partly, you know, that history is determined by the fact that he did not want his work to be reproduced on the cover of books, including books solely dedicated to him and his work. And if you look back at most of the publications, it's true. They're either a monochromatic cover, or if there is an image, it's really, it's a thumbnail, you know. But for me, there was no other image that was going to be on the cover of the book than this one. For me, a book cover sets the stage or scene for the book, and it was quite clear to me that that scene, as we've been talking about it, is an unmade bed. The book is an unmade bed. The classroom is an unmade bed. You know, this is, so my request represented a bit of a conundrum for the foundation that had to sort of grapple with the prospect of, for the first time, allowing an author and a publisher to reproduce the work on the cover and to go against precedent and set a new precedent, perhaps. And the only way I was able to persuade them was through the content itself, through my discussion of Felix's work, in which they made it clear that they were so exhausted, tired with the single narrative in which his work has been inscribed. And that's true, of course. I mean, anyone who is interested in his work and reads the literature, I think at this point, would share that fatigue, you know. And I certainly did, and it was one of the reasons why I wrote about his work differently. And they appreciated that. And a lot of that for them was located in the information around AIDS and Felix's death from AIDS and Ross's lover's death from AIDS. And they did not want that, really. They did not want that discussed, you know. And I hadn't. and for that they were grateful. And I think, it raises a number of ethical issues, about writing history, and potentially erasing histories. But I think it's fair to say that in the case of Felix and his work, that historical narrative about AIDS has not been erased. But what is necessary is to start to think in a different way about his work, from this point in time, and what it can still do for us in a way that doesn't require it to be reinscribed back in once again, as if the only way to respect it and give it its due is to invoke that history each time, So again, not to reinscribe it within a overwrought, overinscribed historical narrative, but also not to evacuate it of its historicity, of its particular power aesthetically and ethically. So at least that's what I tried to do, and they were particularly responsive and appreciative of that.
Reminds me, John, of something that Stephen Andrews once said about his work from the 90s, from he surveyed memorializing work. And he once said to me that Facsimile, which is this extraordinary installation of the faces of men who had died from AIDS-related complications, and he had processed the images and then laid them out on beeswax, and he once said to me that the key to the installation, if we could just scroll down, thank you, I didn't. Yeah. The key to the installation was, he said to me, was about the importance of forgetting. That was the wager, is that not remembering, which is what you think of this. In a sense, how could it be about anything but that, about the work of remembrance? But he said quite to the contrary. It was about the importance of forgetting, which is to say abstaining from a certain way of remembering that he calls forgetting. And the guts to say that about your work in the midst of the amnesia, as Eve Sedgwick says about the pandemic, which is another kind of forgetting. I would say kind of a violently deleterious form of forgetting, but nevertheless to use the language of forgetting to describe your own work, I think is this courage.
Yeah.
Courage.
Yeah. So that it kind of affirms and attests to the fact that forgetting happens, that it's inescapable, it's inevitable. Just like disappearance, I mean, in '96, I actually, with Doug Ishar, included this work in an exhibition that we curated in Chicago called Phagocytes. And then 3 years later, I curated an exhibition called Disappeared. And again, it was an exhibition on a certain kind of artistic response to AIDS. But for some people, they thought, "What a scandal!" It was just within months, almost weeks, of the release of the new cocktail, drug cocktail, which changed everything for so many. And nonetheless, there was a sense of how are you curating an exhibition on AIDS called Disappeared? How is that kind of aesthetics the kind of politics that we want to embrace? It's it kind of, in a very brutal and honest way, sort of confronted that fact. I mean, all the more so, I think, precisely because of the kind of genocidal forces, that were in play at the time, and the need to, almost as Barthes was saying, you have to kind of go further and kind of, exploit and exacerbate and intensify some of those inescapable facts or conditions.
John, can I invite you to say a few concluding remarks for us this evening? Thank you.
Okay. David and I agreed that I might briefly describe where my thinking is these days, current directions that my work is taking, now 2 years after the publication of the decision between us. But before I do that, I want to express my deepest and sincerest gratitude to the speakers this evening. Of course, I wrote this before I heard their, but this is a terrible anticipatory kind of, for their deep and insightful reading of my work, for their illuminating comments, and for their intellectual generosity that, in this part, really is true. It, quite frankly, a bit overwhelming for this author to receive. But receive it I do, given that, like any writer, I dream of just such readers. The kind of readers who are willing to go there with you, not by obediently following, but by actively participating and opening up and tracing the path between writer and reader. And then to turn and say to the writer, this is where I am now located, and even though it cannot be exactly where you might have wanted to lead me, especially since leading a reader down a path toward a determined destination is precisely not the task I set for myself. Nonetheless, this is where I have ended up, at a place and in a way that might not have been possible without your accompaniment. It is this company of readers that accompanies me as I continue to write, the ones who keep me returning to the page, as they appear to me as I write, and as they return the page to me. One writes thanks to this inscriptive space, those blank sheets of paper that the reader offers the writer. Okay. Sometime during the final year of writing the decision between us, I realized that material that I had originally intended to be part of the book would not be able to find room there, and in fact would be best reserved for the next one. It was at this point that I began to consider again the relation between these now 3 books, and to understand them as constituting something of an inadvertent trilogy. Having theorized the outside of attraction and what lures one toward anonymous and imperceptible places of social and sexual attraction in the logic of the lure, and the outside as the space of encounter that is shared in any decision between us, in the most recent book. In the next book, I explored the outside as the instant and opening of socially shared departure and abandonment. So from attraction to encounter to departure. Sorry. I mean, that's ridiculous, but that's... In each work, the outside is not some abstract or transcendental exteriority, but is instead the very spacing around, alongside, and between various configurations of bodies, places, and things. It is in this way that the outside comes to redefine intimacy as its very principle, and so I have taken to referring to the unity of these books as a trilogy on the intimacy of the outside. The third book then, the one that I am currently in the process of completing, carries the title, The Outside Not Beyond. Its focus is on the sovereign erotic excess of bodies, such that by analyzing such acts and gestures that lie either this side of the self or in excess of it, such as edging, drooling, barebacking, sleeping, praying, cruising, stepping, slipping, and falling, bodies come to be defined as exorbitant extremities and not embodied entities. The outside is the source of sense, and it is through our bodies that we experience, or better, are exposed to our first intimations, in other words, senses, of the outside, and hence of sense and meaning. It is through this erotic aesthesis, that is, sense, sensuousness, sensuous sense, and pleasure, that, in always being shared amongst and between bodies, places, and things, we derive a sense of the common. The book is divided into two main parts, one on rhythms of bodily abandonment, the section on corporeal excesses, and the other on spaces of spaces of bodily abandonment. That's the section on architectural and urban excesses. Remaining committed to the essential anonymity of existence, of the social, and of being with and in common, my work continues to chart the path of anonymous singularities in their exceeding of the limits and boundaries of the personal and the private, the autonomous individual and the subject, the domestic and the institutionally sanctioned. Thus, my work is necessarily concerned with the city and addresses the stranger and the passerby as figures of an ethical sociality that can withstand, and there's that issue of stance and standing with, the absence of the name and its legitimating authority. I've presented this work in lectures that some of you have heard, and in published articles that some of you might have read, talks and papers on the art of the consummate cruise and the essential risk of existence, the edge of the common, and the commerce of anonymity. I remain committed to thinking in ethics of leaving and in aesthetics of incompletion, and the pleasure and sense, including a sense of freedom, that can be experienced through both. Nothing less than an erotics of existence, of place, of the social, which is what Barthes was so attuned to, including in his essay, the one that Tom McDonough drew our attention to, Leaving the Movie Theater. So here's a bit more of an excerpt from that essay, one that touches upon many of the interrelated themes that I'm trying to articulate in this new work, some of which Tom had already recited. The movie house, ordinary model, is a site of availability even more than cruising, the inoculation of bodies, which best defines modern eroticism. Not that of advertising or striptease, but that of the big city. It is in this urban dark that the body's freedom is generated. Regardless of how much more infrequently we leave the movie theater these days, or perhaps precisely because this is now ever more the case, the point is not to fixate on the architectural form or spatial location, but on the unglued quality of leaving, departure, and the risks and pleasures of abandonment. So something like the image of an unmade bed on an advertising billboard in the city, its own striptease and its own exceeding, right? To sort of bring all those terms that Barthes wanted to exclude from each other together. To the extent that our work remains committed to the perverse erotic excess and indeed jouissance of bodies in their always shared exposure to each other, and thus to that which remains unnamed in its passion and its power, our work extends beyond disciplinarity and the academy and finds its rightful and just place in the world. So on the occasion of this roundtable discussion and public conversation on queer neutrality, I want to officially announce the launch of a new research working group on sex, ethics, and publics. With support from the Shirk Insight grant that I was awarded last year, I hope many of you will join me in this collaborative venture that seeks to bring together historians and theorists, activists, artists, public and sexual health practitioners, filmmakers, dancers, and performance artists, and anyone else whose work explores the relations between art, architecture, and the city, philosophies of social coexistence, the common and the public, and queer theories, histories, and practices of sexuality, erotics, and pleasure. The goal is to mutually support each other's work at those points of convergence around a series of shared interests and concerns regarding sex, ethics, and publics. And along the way, to never lose sight of aesthetics as one of the principal means of their articulation and political reconfiguration. Okay, to conclude, I just want to say a few things on the question of the neutral, starting with the way in which being with, this notion of being with, as always, erotic sexual rapport in jouissance is not necessarily inscribed within the grid, or doesn't necessarily need to be inscribed within the grid of sexual and gender difference. As Denis Hollier asked many years ago, would being, as in my idiom, being with, let itself be neutralized? Which in part also implies whether being with can be aphallic as well as acephalic, headless, and atelic, without end. Again, something like the stripping of identity, something like a naked image of naked sharing. But the neutral also bears upon the question of the sovereign, precisely in Bataille's terms as that which is not subordinate or servile, but surpassing any position of authority, whether one's own or in relation to another's, including in terms of any decision or exception. The neutral is the voice that says, name no one man. The neutral is the voice that says, name no one name. Hence, there is an inextricable relationship between the neutral and the anonymous. The anonymous is the withdrawal of the name, through and as the name of the nameless. The anonymous is the name of the nameless, the neutral or neuter name, and name of the neutral. The anonymous is the name in its departure and abandonment. It, as Blanchot says, quote, puts the name in place, leaves it, that is, both the place and the name, empty. As if, that is, the anonymous were the place name, but perhaps not the placeholder for the name. Just as for Blanchot, the anonymous puts the name in place, as he says, yet only to be the place of passage for the name and its emptying out of its very own denomination in naming. So with Barthes, the temporality of the neutral is nothing more than a moment or instant, specifically an opportune opening, the kairos of an anonymous topos, we might say. This rather cruisy itinerancy of the anonymous and the neutral is what makes them both operate as lures, yet not in terms of a name, but rather as predicates and adjectives, which is to say, as a certain kind of aesthetic provocation and attraction, and thus an opening of the ethical. For what Barthes more fully says about the kairos of the neutral is that, quote, perhaps the neutral is that, to accept the predicates as nothing more than a moment, a time, like the time of scenes. The kairos, that is, in other words, the opportune moment of the neutral, is the non-nominalizable singularity that is identity. Queer neutrality is the will to love that moment of departure that passes between the anonymous and the predicate, between any one name and any one passing quality. The neutral and the anonymous are thus not the names, or not only the names, but the adjectives and predicates of an originary movement, force, and temporality, of the moments and momentums of being together. This is what I mean by the commerce of anonymity, of which the art of the consummate cruise is one such erotic aesthesis. In light of the unrelenting series of violent events and catastrophes which all too closely seem to resemble the death throes of humanity, it is all the more imperative that in our responses, but also in our non-preemptive creative capacities and creations, countersign in the name of an anonymous neutrality, which is to say at once prior to and in excess of political and theoretical sovereignty. Only in this way do we stand the chance to affirm, as Michael Nace has argued, quote, that there can be no sovereign last word or name to put an end to the violence or the endless destruction. Thank you.